Today's lecture is on storytelling and the concept known as intertextuality. It brings us back to the idea that clothing is a language, and if we take this quote from O'Gara, I think it represents it very well, where he says, "I caress it, I smell it, listen to it. A piece of clothing should speak in so many ways." And I think this is in this embodiment of clothing as a language, which is the important thing. For one of the essay questions will be on storytelling, so the extent to which clothes can add to a narrative of possibly a film, a advertising campaign, a fashion show, a designer's signature. And what I'd like you to do with this is to look at a specific film or an advert or a catwalk show or a piece of clothing or a performance and highlight how clothing can be embedded within a narrative. I think to begin this inquiry, we really need to get to grips with some of the terms that might be linked to this idea of clothing as a language. And the key themes I've pulled out are intertextuality, narrative, appropriation, representation, characterization, mise en scène. These all go towards our understanding of how clothing can actually talk, and I'd like you to possibly do some further research if it's something you're interested in on looking at these terms and how they may relate to art and design. If we take the concept of intertextuality first, it draws partly from a semiotic approach, which is seen as a structuralist approach to how we analyse text. Here the focus was on the text and on the meanings held within it. Our attention is on the structure of the text, the sign, and the meaning is deemed to be held within this very structure. So within a structuralist approach, here the idea is that the text, and by the text we can also mean the artifact, the piece of non-verbal, non-written work, but which can also be a language, as in this case, clothing. So it says here all the meaning is held to be within that very structure, so possibly attributed to it by the designer. So it's the designer or the artist who puts that very meaning within it and uses signs to portray that meaning. As we go into a post-structuralist approach, though, however, this notion of the author is problematized. Barthes, taking this approach further, declared the death of the author and the birth of the reader, and within this context it was saying that the text unity lies not in its origin but it's in its destination. So it's not so much about what the author or the designer was putting into the work, but it's more about how us as an audience may read that piece, and therein lies the meaning. I've directed you to what I find is a very interesting blog spot on this by a writer called Rachel Ward, who explores some of these concepts in a little bit more detail, specifically in relation to fashion. And here she says that signs are meaningless if there are no other ones to compare them with. Intertextuality is relating something to a well-known reference from the past. For example, Madonna wearing a crucifix doesn't show her Christian nature, but is a rebellious misappropriation of something with traditional significance. So here we've got a few interesting concepts. The idea of misappropriation. So this idea of appropriation is about taking something, a sign and symbol from somewhere else, and using it to maybe subvert the original meaning or to add weight to that original meaning. So in this instance, it's to do with religion. The Sex Pistols and the punk movement in particular was very clever with this idea of appropriation, so appropriating the image of the Queen but then subverting it with a safety pin. It was to do with the means within which they sort of produced items and produced clothing as well, which took on all sorts of different meanings. I think it's then interesting how this punk look is then appropriated within the shops. So, the colour black, the materials being quite significant, the tartan here, the buckles, the studding, they're all appropriated from that punk era, that punk look. But possibly because of the context, the meanings have slightly changed. There's a link there to the YouTube clip for the Filth and the Fury film from the punks, which again explores the subculture in a little bit more detail. And again, becomes the story, the history of punk. Rachel Ward in her blogspot goes further to look at as well the role of the media. The media is key, I suppose, to this embedding of a narrative. It's a telling of a story through its stories. Maybe it's reports on fashion shows, it's reports on designers, the way it uses advertising to talk about clothing, to talk about designer. But she contextualises this within a postmodern society and saying that actually within postmodernism we have no single authority. The media becomes the only thing that can legitimise fashion. So postmodern idea, the idea that we have many different references from all different places that are used in possibly ironic ways and used in subversion ways. And this goes to another interesting concept known as bricolage, which is basically sort of mixing stuff that doesn't quite go together. It's again what many subcultures do. They appropriate from another subculture to then sort of to twist it. So we could say, you know, the chavs and their use of the Burberry check is partly a bricolage. It's taking something from a different context and putting it into their own. Again, another interesting website that I found which looks at this concept, but in relation to rap and hip-hop, sort of contests that rap, hip-hop and grunge emerged as a contestation of both cultural forms and public space among groups who had been marginalised in terms of labour markets, political parties and housing. So a group of people who became sort of disenfranchised, became marginalised through society. And it says their bricolage, like that the punks before them, constituted profound political statements in an arena available to them, while the others that we normally associate with political power were closed off to them. So clothing in this aspect becomes a political statement. It becomes a sense of self as people and political people within a society that may have marginalised us. So within this notion of intertextuality, what I say is important is the idea that we're looking for other texts, and it's the idea that other texts, other influences have come into being on a single piece of in our case, sort of clothing, and that becomes central to what Barthes claims is the death of the author. It says a text is a multi-dimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. So this idea, I suppose, as designers, that we take in on board lots of different influences and blend them and clash them into something else. But Barthes is saying that none of these are really ever original. The text is a mixture of quotations, it's a mixture of inspirations. The writer can only initiate a gesture that is always anterior, never original. His only power is to mix writings, to counter the ones with the others in such a way as never to rest on any one of them. Again, this important sort of concept relating to this idea of storytelling and of narrative within clothing. As a term, we can follow these terms back to their original sort of starting point, and with intertextuality, it was really born in the 1960s. Again, a time of much change, a time of much sort of gesturing, posturing of people as to the meanings they wanted to sort of portray in their work, drawing very much on beginnings of a postmodern sort of identity, which was seen as quite fluid, could come from all different sources. And Christopher is interesting, talks about this analysis of text in terms of two axes. So we have the horizontal axis, which connects the author and the reader of a text. So simply put, I suppose it's that person when we go to the shop and we're viewing an item within an area. It's that relationship between us and the piece, and possibly the designer, because quite often branding is very important text in this relation to give us meaning, to give us sort of symbolism as to the value of a piece. But then it also talks about a vertical axis, which is about connecting the text to other text. Within clothing, this is probably most easily felt within a catwalk sort of context. So where we have a magazine that has sort of images from a catwalk show, and then possibly the cheaper version that you can buy on the high street. What is important is we have that text of the original fashion show to give weight and meaning to the piece, to say this is in fashion, this is in style at any particular time. I think Yinka Yonibari, we've looked at before, is very clever in this use of text and of other references to produce a work that we see as original, we see as having originality in its execution, but is reliant on another piece. So in this case, the Mr. and Mrs. Andrews done by Gainsborough. So it's in this sort of translation and this appropriation of gestures, of stance, of sort of style, that add weight to the final piece. And the extent to which we are able to read the original piece depends upon our knowledge of the related text, the related inspiration. Advertising, magazines are very clever within this. It is all about telling a story, and so we look at this image we have here on the right of an athlete and a supermodel in a particular stance, in a particular sort of gesture, and we can relate it back to a war propaganda poster, which was destroy this mad brute, which brings into idea potentially racist undertones, this idea of fear, xenophobia, fear of the exotic, fear of the unknown. And it's interesting how, yes, we have taken some key elements of stance, of colour and of shape to translate that piece. So in this context, textuality is that meaning is not simply transferred from the writer or the maker to the reader or the viewer, the horizontal axis. It's also mediated through other codes. So, as I've said, genre, structure, form, materials, and they all form part of a mosaic of text in dialogue with each other. Say sometimes it's in the form of direct quotes, or in our case with a direct visuals, direct sort of appropriation of possibly a print, of a colourway, of a way of doing something. A silhouette becomes a text, and saying that this is actually more implicit. It's this vertical axis of reference. It says texts are woven out of numerous discourses spun from already existing meanings. So something like minimalism being born out the whole sort of modernism approach to design. That's part of a discourse. Again, we can look back at some of these visuals and analyse them in more detail. So Naomi Campbell here, featured in Vogue Italia's July issue 2008. We take on board the semi-naked model, the pose she's taken, the discarded fruit and vegetables, the whole sort of setting in which it's taken. And we can relate this back to Manet's Olympia, although here we have juxtaposed issues to do with class and to do with race within that context. So when we're looking for this idea of narrative and storytelling, these are all the things that we're pulling out, and to what extent we fully know the context of both the piece that we're looking at and then the text that it may relate to. AES plus F, a very interesting Russian art collective, which have taken a very fashion approach to their art. They produced a series of videos which were presented in very large galleries, and it was about taking the fashion shoot and art and architectural history to talk about issues to do with consumption and leisure in a modern world. And we lose some of the impact of this just looking at it on a smaller screen, and as I say, these screens would have been split and we would have been viewing them in a very different context. But what is important is how they're drawing out elements of location. So this mise en scene, this setting of our characters within a space and a visual space, and then the use of clothing and gesturing within this, the colours and the materials that are used, the technique that was employed as well within this. let's say, allow you to have a look closer at the videos which are available. So I would encourage you to do that. Say what they were trying to get across was in this within particularly within a Russian context, this idea of sort of consumption and spectacle, and how it's then transformed into contemporary and global forms of leisure and pleasure. But as they say, that is very much about their referencing to other historical paintings, other historical discourses. So the gesturing, the posturing, is then be related back to a further text. And whether this is intentional, it's sort of a conscious thing, or it's maybe an unconscious thing. Again, Courbet's Young Ladies by the River Seine. Again, you know, the original meanings of leisure and of consumption and of luxury. So within this context, clothing becomes very deliberate. It becomes a deliberate portrayal of certain characters, of certain meaning that they're hoping to portray. Be these cultural, so drawing on cultural and traditional dress. We have uniform, so military, again with the very embedded sort of narratives. The models that are chosen, the way in which they are postured. Here, presenting a very luxurious sort of scene, which can be related back to mid 1800 painting Romans of the decadence. So drawing on our ideas of, again, decadence, luxury, and leisure. Another piece of their work is called The Last Riot, and this draws more on narratives from digital games and employs younger models in it. But again, the symbolism within their dress and posture is very important. Again, I'd encourage you to have a look a little bit further at that. It was very clever in the way that it was made. It wasn't through conventional videoing techniques. It was actually a whole series of stills, of photographs, which were then put together to make the final piece, which gives it that sort of fluidity. It gives it that sort of jerky sort of sensation. And as I say, the collective is made up of people from fashion industry, so they will have known, they will have had this knowledge of other texts that they were looking at. So in the case here, we have the Calvin Klein jeans advert, which we relate back to some ideas of style and status, particularly of women, is quite sort of degrading and quite a sort of horrific image here, and how it's then represented out again in something like The Last Riot. Now, you could argue that some of these contexts are possibly a little bit tenuous. Are they just a coincidence? Are we drawing on the same sort of, cultural references, and therefore there's naturally going to be some crossovers? As I say, we need to do further research into the intentions and the inspiration that the artists and the designers will have had at that time. Again, making links to old paintings, to then future representations of this within a modern context. But our intertextuality, as I say, when we're looking at clothing, we're looking at design, it is about a visual sort of, this non-verbal communication that we can take off, and these direct links, which we would call, inspiration. It's the development of our mood boards and how we then translate those moods and those ideas into a final piece. So Mondrian painting on the right hand side, with then the the dress here we have on the left as a direct reference. Japanese street art, which was very popular, very interesting to look at several years ago. Was this again this bricolage? It brings us back to this idea of bricolage of ideas, a whole mixing and matching of different styles, different reference points. So the ladies on the left with their cowboy hats and our Clint Eastwood character, do they share something in common? Is there a link here between them? And I think, yes, that actually, texts can be related, and they can show an internet connectivity to each other. As it states, they may be conscious and they may be unconscious. As I say, part of what we do as a collective is if we pick up on the zeitgeist, we pick up on the spirit of the times, and so sometimes these reference points are taken in subconsciously. We're not fully aware of it, of our influence. We looked at the impact of advertising the other day, and so it's natural that some of that will come into our conscious mind and then will be played out in possibly a very conscious way. So looking at our inspiration, it's the food that we take from the mood board, and I think it would be good for you to take some time to think about the intertextuality in your own work. As I say, that it may be conscious and may also be subconscious. So what are we inspired by? What are we trying to put across in our work? Are there artists and the designers that we align ourselves with, that we admire, and how can we draw on their use of symbolism within their work? But intertextuality and storytelling is also about narrative. It's about the adaptation. As a costume designer, quite often we're just given a text, so we are quite literally given written words, which we then have to communicate. We then need to translate into a visual language, and that is where the idea of the story becomes very important. But I think equally, as fashion designers, this narrative, this adaptation comes from maybe our design development to actually producing a final piece that will walk down a catwalk, and the catwalk becomes the story, the catwalk becomes the narrative. Equally with advertising, the whole setting of that photo shoot becomes all important in that non-verbal communication of a text. So dress within this also becomes a representation. It's about tangibility and visibility to a character, pulling that character from a written script into a believable person. It's about setting them within a context, so drawing on historical and sociological data, which will enable that the character is correct for its time, correct for its place. It may be also about bringing an old story up to date, which is what AES plus F were doing in their work, the story of consumption, the story of possibly of greed, of capitalism, of leisure being brought up to date through the use of quite sort of fashion techniques. So I've put together a few slides from different sort of films, and it's about trying to identify the historical and sociological context of the films and the images that include. It's about thinking about what are the key aspects of the story being communicated. I think within this context it's quite interesting to look at that idea of storytelling. It's argued that there are only actually sort of 8 stories that are constantly told over and over again, but in different settings, with different characters, with different sort of visual effects. So something like Breakfast at Tiffany's, we had a look at the work of Chanel, so the little black dress, so of its time, representing changes in fashion for the time, but also about being a modern woman. And I think that also it was very much about transformation. So Audrey Hepburn's character through clothing goes through a process of transformation, similar to Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman, where here we see her representation. She's an actress, but she's representing a prostitute, and clothing adds weight to that representation. To then again this sense of transformation, where she's transformed from her prostitute clothes into her modern, elegant women's clothes, and accepted within this context where she hadn't been accepted before. In terms of these vertical texts that we can look at, these other texts that can add weight to our analysis of the piece is, again, something like Pygmalion, which became My Fair Lady, which again is this before and after, particularly of women. And I think it is within that context that we see clothing being a transformative element of our characters. Similarly with something like Priscilla, Queen of the Deserts, clothing becomes a means through which characters are transformed from their original state into their drag state. And interesting again, the interpretations of that drag style, and drawing, again, very different sort of context. So we've got some flip-flops here. They become also sort of texts within that. Saturday Night Fever, so the iconic white suit, becoming a symbol of that time, becoming all part of that story of, coolness, I suppose. Sandy is transformed by her clothing from someone who's uncool to someone who's cool by the donning of shiny